In the hills of ancient Judah around 700 BC, scribes were carefully copying texts onto papyrus and parchment that would survive for nearly 3 millennia. These weren't just religious documents, they were historical records, legal codes, political manifestos, and social commentaries that provide us with an unprecedented window into the ancient Near Eastern world. Today, we're going to examine some of the most historically significant yet overlooked texts from the Hebrew Bible. These aren't the familiar stories of Noah's Ark or Moses parting the Red Sea that have dominated popular culture. Instead, we're going to investigate the historical context, archaeological evidence, and cultural significance of texts that reveal how ancient peoples grappled with governance, social justice, economic systems, and human suffering. What makes these texts historically fascinating is that they weren't written in isolation. They emerged from specific historical circumstances, reflected the political and social realities of their time, and influenced the development of legal systems, governance structures, and social movements that shaped Western civilization. Through careful historical analysis, we can reconstruct not just what these texts say, but why they were written, who wrote them, and how they functioned in their original historical context. The Hebrew Bible, or Tanakh, represents one of the most extensively documented literary traditions from the ancient world. Unlike many ancient texts that survive only in fragments, we have multiple manuscript traditions, archaeological evidence, and comparative texts from neighboring cultures that allow us to place these writings in their proper historical context. Over the next hour, we'll examine for distinct but interconnected historical phenomena. We'll investigate how the wisdom literature of ancient Israel compared two similar texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia, and what this tells us about international cultural exchange in the ancient Near East. We'll analyze the historical circumstances that produced the prophetic movement and examine how these texts functioned as political and social commentary in their original context. We'll explore the historical background of the Book of Job and its relationship to similar wisdom literature throughout the ancient world. Finally, we'll trace the historical influence of these texts on later legal systems, political movements, and social reforms. This is not a study of religious beliefs, but rather a historical investigation into some of the most influential texts in human history. These documents shaped legal systems, influenced political movements, and provided intellectual frameworks that continue to influence how societies organize themselves today. To understand the historical significance of the Book of Proverbs, we must first understand the broader context of wisdom literature in the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant reveals that formal wisdom schools operated throughout the region from at least the 3rd millennium BC, serving as training centers for scribes, administrators, and government officials. The Egyptian instruction of Ptah-hotep, dating to around 2400 BC, provides striking parallels to later Hebrew proverbs. Both traditions emphasize practical advice for navigating court politics, managing relationships with superiors, and maintaining social harmony. This suggests that the Hebrew wisdom tradition was part of a broader international exchange of ideas and administrative practices. Archaeological excavations at sites like Lachish and Arad have uncovered ostraca pottery shards with writing that demonstrate the widespread literacy and administrative sophistication of ancient Israel and Judah. These discoveries support the historical plausibility of organized wisdom schools that would have produced and preserved collections like Proverbs. The Book of Proverbs itself provides internal evidence of its historical development. The text explicitly mentions the Proverbs of Solomon, the words of Agur, and the words of King Lemuel, suggesting compilation from multiple sources over time. This matches the pattern we see in other ancient Near Eastern wisdom collections, which typically grew through accumulation of materials from various teachers and traditions. Historical analysis reveals that the wisdom literature served specific social and political functions in ancient Israel. These texts weren't abstract philosophical treatises but practical handbooks for training government officials, merchants, and skilled craftsmen. The emphasis on proper speech, for example, reflects the importance of diplomatic and administrative communication in ancient kingdoms that relied on complex bureaucratic systems. The international character of ancient Israel's wisdom tradition is evident in Proverbs chapter 30, which includes the words of Agur, son of Jakihuv, Massa, apparently a non-Israelite source. This demonstrates the cosmopolitan nature of ancient Near Eastern intellectual culture, where ideas and practices cross ethnic and political boundaries. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites like Mari and Nutsi shows that ancient Near Eastern kingdoms maintained extensive diplomatic and commercial networks. The wisdom literature's emphasis on proper conduct in diverse social situations reflects the practical needs of people operating in this international environment. The historical context becomes even clearer when we examine the legal and economic systems reflected in Proverbs. The text assumes a complex commercial economy with standardized weights and measures, formal legal procedures, and established property rights. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout ancient Israel confirms the existence of these systems during the monarchical period. The wisdom tradition also reflects the social stratification of ancient Near Eastern societies. The text assumes the existence of distinct social classes: kings, nobles, merchants, farmers, and slaves, and provides guidance for navigating relationships across these social boundaries. This mirrors the social structures revealed by archaeological evidence from ancient Near Eastern sites. One of the most historically significant aspects of Hebrew wisdom literature is its relationship to royal court culture. Many proverbs specifically address the behavior of kings and courtiers, suggesting that this literature functioned as a kind of manual for court administration. This is consistent with archaeological evidence showing that ancient Near Eastern kingdoms maintained sophisticated administrative systems. The timing of the wisdom literature's compilation is historically significant. Most scholars date the final form of Proverbs to the post-exilic period, when the Jewish community was reconstituting itself after the Babylonian exile. This suggests that the preservation and organization of traditional wisdom was part of a broader cultural recovery and identity formation process. The historical influence of this wisdom tradition extends far beyond ancient Israel. The Greek translation of Hebrew wisdom literature, known as the Septuagint, made these texts available to the broader Mediterranean world. Elements of Hebrew wisdom appear in later Greek and Roman philosophical works, demonstrating the international influence of these ancient texts. The emphasis on practical ethics and social responsibility in Hebrew wisdom literature also influenced the development of later legal traditions. The concern for fair business practices, honest governance, and social justice that appears in Proverbs can be traced through Jewish law, early Christian teachings, and eventually into medieval and modern legal systems. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate the historical context of Hebrew wisdom literature. Recent excavations at Khirbet Qeiyafa, identified by some scholars as biblical Shaaraim, have revealed sophisticated urban planning and administrative systems that support the historical plausibility of the complex society reflected. In wisdom literature, the preservation of Hebrew wisdom literature through multiple manuscript traditions, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, medieval Hebrew manuscripts, and ancient translations, demonstrates the historical importance these texts held for ancient communities. The care taken to preserve and transmit these texts suggests they served essential social and educational functions. Understanding the historical context of Hebrew wisdom literature helps us appreciate its significance not just as ancient religious texts, but as historical documents that provide insight into the social, economic, and political structures of ancient Near Eastern civilizations. These texts serve as windows into a complex and sophisticated ancient world that continues to influence human societies today. The prophetic movement in ancient Israel represents one of the most remarkable political and social phenomena in the ancient Near East. To understand its historical significance, we must examine the specific circumstances that produced these voices of dissent and their unprecedented challenge to established authority structures. The historical context begins with the rise of the monarchy in ancient Israel around 1000 BCE. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer reveals the rapid development of centralized administrative systems, monumental architecture, and economic specialization during this period. This transformation from tribal confederation to centralized monarchy created new social tensions that would eventually produce the prophetic movement. The prophet Amos, who prophesied around 760 BC, provides our earliest historically documented example of this phenomenon. His prophecies coincide with a period of economic prosperity in the northern kingdom of Israel, confirmed by archaeological evidence showing expanded trade networks and increased wealth concentration. However, this prosperity came at a cost. The archaeological record also shows increased social stratification and evidence of economic exploitation. The historical circumstances of Amos's ministry are crucial to understanding his message. He prophesied during the reign of Jeroboam I, when Israel had expanded its territory and trade relationships. Archaeological excavations at Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, reveal extensive ivory decorations and luxury goods that confirm the wealth described in Amos's prophecies. Yet excavations at smaller sites show evidence of economic hardship and social displacement. The international context is equally important. The Assyrian Empire was expanding westward, creating political pressure on smaller kingdoms like Israel and Judah. The prophetic literature reflects this tension, with frequent references to international politics and the dangers of foreign alliances. The prophets weren't just social critics, they were political analysts commenting on the geopolitical realities of their time. Archaeological evidence from Assyrian sites provides external confirmation of many prophetic claims. Assyrian annals describe tribute payments from Israel and Judah, supporting the prophetic criticism of royal policies that drained national resources. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser III actually depicts Jehu, king of Israel, paying tribute to the Assyrian king, a humiliating scene that validates prophetic warnings about the costs of political compromise. The prophet Hosea, writing slightly later than Amos, provides additional historical insight into the political instability of the northern kingdom. His prophecies coincide with a period of rapid dynastic change, with several kings assassinated in quick succession. This political chaos, documented in both biblical and Assyrian sources, forms the backdrop for Hosea's metaphorical language about Israel's unfaithfulness. The prophetic movement's historical significance becomes even clearer when we examine its relationship to ancient Near Eastern diplomatic and legal traditions. The prophets employed a literary form known as the covenant lawsuit, which followed established patterns of international treaty enforcement. When prophets accused Israel of breaking covenant with God, they were using legal language that would have been familiar to anyone versed in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. Micah, who prophesied during the late 8th century, provides historical insight into the social and economic changes accompanying urbanization in ancient Judah. His prophecies against those who covet fields and seize them reflect the historical transition from traditional tribal land tenure to more complex property relationships. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased urban development and changes in agricultural practices that support Micah's historical observations. The historical context of the prophetic movement is further illuminated by comparative evidence from neighboring cultures. Ancient Near Eastern kingdoms typically employed court prophets who supported royal policies and legitimized government actions. The Hebrew prophets' criticism of royal authority was historically unprecedented and politically dangerous. Several prophets faced persecution or exile for their opposition to government policies. The prophetic movement's historical impact extends beyond ancient Israel. The prophets' criticism of social injustice and their vision of ethical governance influenced later political movements throughout history. The concept of holding rulers accountable to higher moral standards, which seems natural to us today, was revolutionary in the ancient world and can be traced directly to the Hebrew prophetic tradition. Archaeological discoveries continue to illuminate the historical context of the prophetic movement. The Siloam inscription, discovered in Jerusalem, provides evidence of the massive public works projects undertaken by King Hezekiah, including the tunnel system that brought water into the city during the Assyrian siege. This archaeological evidence supports the historical accuracy of prophetic accounts of this period. The preservation of prophetic literature through the Babylonian exile and Persian period demonstrates the historical importance these texts held for the Jewish community. The fact that these often politically subversive texts were preserved and transmitted suggests they were viewed as historically significant documents, not just religious literature. The prophetic movement also had significant influence on the development of historical writing in ancient Israel, the prophetic emphasis on interpreting contemporary events in light of moral and ethical principles contributed to the development of the Deuteronomistic history, which provided a theological interpretation of Israel's political history. The historical methodology of the prophets, their insistence on connecting moral behavior to political consequences, influenced later historical writing and political analysis. The prophetic tradition established the principle that political events should be evaluated according to ethical criteria, not just pragmatic considerations. Recent archaeological work at sites like Tel Dan and Khirbet Qeiyafa has provided new evidence for the historical context of the prophetic movement. These excavations reveal the complex political and social dynamics of the ancient Near East during the period when the prophetic movement emerged. The international influence of the prophetic movement is evident in its impact on later religious and political movements. The prophetic emphasis on social justice and ethical governance can be traced through Jewish law, early Christian teaching, Islamic jurisprudence, and eventually into modern concepts of human rights and social responsibility. Understanding the prophetic movement in its historical context reveals it as one of the most significant political and social phenomena in ancient history. These texts provide invaluable insight into the social, economic, and political dynamics of ancient Near Eastern civilizations, while also documenting the emergence of ideas about governance, justice, and social responsibility that continue to influence human societies today. The Book of Job represents one of the most sophisticated philosophical and literary achievements of the ancient world, but to understand its historical significance, we must examine it within the broader context of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature and the intellectual traditions of the time. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 20th century revealed that the themes and literary forms found in Job were part of a widespread ancient Near Eastern tradition of wisdom literature dealing with suffering and divine justice. The Babylonian text Ludlel Bel Nemeki, sometimes called the Babylonian Job, shares remarkable similarities with the Hebrew text, including a righteous sufferer who maintains his integrity despite severe trials. The Egyptian admonitions of Ipuwer and the Mesopotamian dialogue of pessimism demonstrate that ancient Near Eastern intellectuals were grappling with many of the same philosophical questions that appear in Job. This comparative evidence suggests that Job emerged from a sophisticated international intellectual tradition that crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries. The historical dating of Job presents interesting challenges that illuminate the text's development. While the story is set in a patriarchal period, the language and theological concepts suggest composition during the monarchical or post-exilic periods. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tama and Dedan in northwestern Arabia provides historical context for Job's setting. These were important trading centers that connected Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt. The international character of these trading networks helps explain the cosmopolitan nature of Job's wisdom and the text's familiarity with diverse cultural traditions. The text of Job reveals detailed knowledge of ancient mining and metallurgy, particularly in chapter 28's description of mining operations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Timna in the Araba confirms the existence of sophisticated copper mining operations in the ancient Near East, supporting the historical accuracy of Job's technical descriptions. The legal procedures described in Job reflect the complex judicial systems of ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. The concept of a legal advocate, the procedures for presenting evidence, and the emphasis on witness testimony all correspond to legal practices documented in ancient Mesopotamian law codes like those of Hammurabi and the Assyrian. Legal traditions. The historical context of Job's composition is further illuminated by its relationship to other ancient Near Eastern theodicy literature. The text's sophisticated treatment of divine justice and human suffering suggests it was produced by educated scribes who were familiar with international philosophical traditions and legal concepts. The book's literary structure reflects the influence of ancient Near Eastern diplomatic and legal traditions. The framework narrative surrounding the poetic dialogue follows patterns found in ancient treaties and legal documents, suggesting the author was familiar with international diplomatic protocols. Archaeological discoveries at Ugarit have revealed extensive libraries containing texts from across the ancient Near East, demonstrating the international exchange of ideas that characterize the region. This context helps explain how the author of Job could have been familiar with diverse philosophical and literary traditions. The historical development of Job is evident in the text's composite nature. Most scholars identify at least two major compositional layers: the prose framework and the poetic dialogue. This suggests the text developed over time, with different authors contributing to its final form. This pattern of textual development is consistent with other ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature. The text's treatment of international relations and trade provides historical insights into ancient Near Eastern commercial networks. Job's initial wealth is described in terms of livestock and trade goods, reflecting the pastoral and commercial economy of the ancient Near East. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the region confirms the existence of extensive trade networks that moved goods across vast distances. The historical significance of Job extends beyond its literary merits to its influence on later philosophical and legal traditions. The text's sophisticated treatment of individual rights, divine justice, and the limits of human knowledge influenced later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theological development. The preservation of Job through multiple manuscript traditions demonstrates its historical importance. The text appears in Hebrew manuscripts, ancient translations, and was included in the Dead Sea Scrolls, indicating its significance for ancient Jewish communities. The care taken to preserve and transmit this text suggests it was viewed as an important cultural and intellectual achievement. The book's influence on later literature is historically significant. Elements of Job appear in Greek philosophical works, early Christian writings, and Islamic literature, demonstrating the international influence of this ancient Hebrew text. The text's treatment of suffering and divine justice influenced theological development across multiple religious traditions. Recent archaeological work at sites like Khurba-ten Nahas has revealed the extent of ancient mining operations in the region, providing additional historical context for Job's technical descriptions. These discoveries confirm the sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and mining techniques reflected in the text. The historical methodology evident in Job, its careful analysis of cause and effect, its systematic examination of different explanations for suffering, and its rigorous intellectual honesty represents an important development in ancient Near Eastern thought. The text's refusal to accept simple explanations for complex phenomena demonstrates a sophisticated approach to intellectual inquiry. The international character of Job's wisdom is historically significant because it demonstrates the cosmopolitan nature of ancient Near Eastern intellectual culture. The text's familiarity with diverse cultural traditions, legal systems, and philosophical approaches indicates the existence of international scholarly networks that facilitated the exchange of ideas. The book's treatment of individual rights and personal integrity reflects important developments in ancient Near Eastern legal and ethical thinking. The concept that individuals have inherent dignity and rights that cannot be violated, even by divine authority, represents a significant advance in ancient legal and philosophical thought. Understanding Job in its historical context reveals it as one of the most sophisticated intellectual achievements of the ancient world. The text provides invaluable insight into ancient Near Eastern philosophical traditions, legal systems, and international cultural exchange, while also documenting the development of ideas about individual rights, divine justice, and intellectual integrity that continue to influence human societies today. Archaeological evidence of political sophistication. The Omride dynasty, established by King Omri around 880 BCE, represents one of the most archaeologically documented periods in ancient Israel's history. Excavations at Samaria, the capital city founded by Omri, reveal sophisticated urban planning, advanced water systems, and extensive international trade networks that demonstrate the administrative capabilities of this often overlooked dynasty. The famous Mesha stele, discovered in Jordan in 1868, provides external confirmation of Omride political influence. This Moabite inscription describes King Mesha's rebellion against Israelite control, specifically mentioning Omri and his son Ahab. The stele indicates that the Omrides controlled territory extending well beyond traditional Israelite boundaries, suggesting expansionist policies that made Israel a regional power. Assyrian records from this period refer to Israel as Bit Humri, the house of Omri, even long after the dynasty's fall. This nomenclature in international diplomatic correspondence suggests that Omri established Israel's reputation as a significant political entity in ancient Near Eastern international relations, strategic alliances, and cultural integration. Omri's son Ahab pursued sophisticated diplomatic strategies that included marriage alliances with neighboring kingdoms. His marriage to Jezebel, daughter of the Sidonian king, represented standard ancient Near Eastern diplomatic practice designed to secure trade relationships and military alliances. Archaeological evidence from Tel Jezreel and other sites reveals the cultural complexity this diplomacy created. Phoenician architectural elements, artistic styles, and religious practices appeared alongside traditional Israelite cultural markers, indicating successful integration of international influences with local traditions. The political tensions these alliances created are reflected in the biblical narratives about Elijah and other prophets who opposed foreign religious practices. These conflicts weren't simply theological disputes but reflected deeper political questions about cultural identity, international alignment, and the balance between diplomatic necessity and cultural preservation. Administrative innovation and economic development. Excavations at Samaria reveal sophisticated administrative systems including standardized weights and measures, extensive storage facilities, and evidence of specialized craft production. Ostraca discovered at the site document complex taxation and resource management systems that supported the dynasty's military and diplomatic activities. The Omrides' administrative innovations included the development of Israel's first permanent capital city with monumental architecture comparable to other ancient Near Eastern royal centers. This urban planning demonstrated political sophistication and projected power to both domestic and international audiences. Their economic policies fostered international trade relationships that brought prosperity but also created social tensions documented in prophetic literature. The archaeological record shows both increased wealth and evidence of social stratification that would later contribute to political instability, political downfall, and historical assessment. The Omride dynasty's collapse illustrates the challenges of balancing international diplomacy with domestic political pressures. Jehu's coup, supported by prophetic opposition to foreign cultural influences, ended the dynasty but also disrupted the international relationships that had brought economic prosperity. Assyrian records document the immediate aftermath of this political upheaval, showing how internal political changes in Israel affected broader regional dynamics. The dynasty's fall demonstrates the complex relationship between domestic politics and international relations in the ancient Near East. Modern political analysis can find insights in the Omride experience about the challenges of cultural integration, the tensions between international engagement and cultural preservation, and the political risks of rapid social and economic change. Historical context of female monarchy. Queen Athaliah's 6-year reign in Judah c. 8 for 2836 BC represents the only recorded instance of a woman ruling independently in ancient Israel or Judah. Her rise to power following the death of her son Ahaziah reveals the complex succession dynamics and political maneuvering that characterized ancient Near Eastern monarchies. Archaeological evidence from this period, including administrative documents and material culture, suggests that Athaliah's reign was marked by political stability and continued international relationships. The absence of destruction layers at major sites during her reign indicates that she successfully maintained internal order and external security. Comparative evidence from other ancient Near Eastern cultures shows that female rulers, while rare, were not unprecedented. Queens like Hatshepsut in Egypt and later Dido in Carthage demonstrated that women could successfully exercise political authority in the ancient world, though they typically faced unique challenges regarding legitimacy and succession. Political strategy and administrative competence. Athaliah's consolidation of power required eliminating potential rival claimants to the throne, a practice that, while brutal by modern standards, followed established patterns of succession management in ancient Near Eastern monarchies. Similar actions by male rulers rarely receive the same historical criticism, suggesting gender-based double standards in evaluating political ruthlessness. The biblical account indicates that Athaliah ruled for 6 years without apparent internal rebellion or external invasion, suggesting administrative competence and political skill. Her ability to maintain power demonstrates sophisticated understanding of court politics, military management, and diplomatic relationships. Archaeological evidence from Jerusalem during this period shows continued construction projects and economic activity, indicating that her reign provided sufficient stability for normal administrative and commercial functions. This contradicts narratives that portray her reign as chaotic or illegitimate. Religious and cultural policies. Athaliah's religious policies, which apparently included support for Baal worship inherited from her Omride family connections, created tensions with traditional Yahwistic religious establishments. These conflicts weren't simply theological but reflected broader political questions about cultural identity and international alignment. The preservation of Josh by temple priests represents institutional resistance to royal religious policies, demonstrating the complex relationship between religious establishments and political authority in ancient Israel and Judah. This tension between royal prerogative and religious autonomy would continue throughout the monarchical period. Her religious policies may have reflected pragmatic political calculations about maintaining relationships with neighboring kingdoms where Baal worship was prevalent. Ancient Near Eastern diplomacy often included religious dimensions, and Athaliah's policies might have served diplomatic as well as personal religious purposes. Downfall and historical legacy. Athaliah's overthrow by a coalition of priests and military officials illustrates the importance of institutional support for political legitimacy in ancient kingdoms. Her downfall resulted from losing the backing of key institutional pillars rather than external military defeat or popular uprising. The violent nature of her death and the subsequent elimination of Baal worship reflects the intensity of political and religious conflicts in ancient Judah. These events demonstrate how religious and political authority intersected in ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. Historical assessment of Athaliah's reign has been complicated by the hostile biblical narrative and traditional gender biases in historical interpretation. Archaeological evidence suggests a more complex evaluation is warranted, recognizing both her political achievements and the legitimate concerns her policies raised about cultural and religious continuity. Modern analysis of Athaliah's reign offers insights into the challenges female leaders face in establishing political legitimacy, the role of institutional support in maintaining power, and the complex relationship between personal religious conviction and political pragmatism. King Josiah's reign 640–609 BC coincided with the decline of Assyrian power and represents one of the most archaeologically documented periods of religious and political reform in ancient Judah. Excavations throughout the former kingdom of Judah reveal evidence of cult site destruction and centralization, of religious practices that corroborate biblical accounts of Josiah's religious reforms. The discovery of cult objects deliberately destroyed and buried at sites like Arad and Beersheba provides material evidence for systematic religious reform during this period. These archaeological findings suggest that Josiah's religious centralization was implemented through coordinated administrative action rather than spontaneous religious revival. Inscriptional evidence, including the famous Ket Ephinim silver amulets, indicates increased emphasis on Yahwistic religious practices during Josiah's reign. These artifacts suggest that religious reform had popular support and wasn't simply imposed by royal decree. Political strategy behind religious reform. Josiah's religious reforms served political as well as theological purposes. By eliminating foreign religious practices and centralizing worship in Jerusalem, he asserted Judahite cultural independence during a period of declining Assyrian control. This religious nationalism supported his broader political goal of territorial expansion and independence. Archaeological evidence from sites in the former northern kingdom shows Judahite administrative presence during Josiah's reign, suggesting successful territorial expansion that accompanied religious reform. This expansion represented the first Judahite control over former Israelite territory since the kingdom's division. The timing of Josiah's reforms correlates with documented Assyrian withdrawal from the Levant, indicating sophisticated political analysis of changing international circumstances. His reforms can be interpreted as strategic positioning for independence rather than purely religious motivation. International diplomatic challenges. Josiah's political miscalculation regarding Egyptian-Babylonian rivalry ultimately led to his downfall. His decision to oppose Pharaoh Necho's march through Judahite territory in 609 BCE demonstrated poor understanding of the shifting international balance of power. The Battle of Megiddo, where Josiah was killed, represents a crucial moment in ancient Near Eastern politics. Archaeological evidence from Megiddo confirms its strategic importance as a military crossroads, explaining why Josiah felt compelled to control this location despite the military risks. Egyptian records from this period document the broader context of Necho's campaign, which was intended to support the failing Assyrian Empire against rising Babylonian power. Josiah's opposition to this campaign aligned Judah with Babylonian interests, with long-term consequences for the kingdom's survival, administrative and legal. Innovations. The discovery of the Book of the Law during temple renovation represents one of the most significant legal developments in ancient Near Eastern history. Whether this represents genuine archaeological discovery or literary device, the legal reforms attributed to this discovery show sophisticated legal thinking. Archaeological evidence for increased literacy during Josiah's reign, including numerous ostraca and seals, suggests expanded administrative capacity that would have been necessary for implementing comprehensive legal and religious reforms. The emphasis on covenant renewal and legal standardization reflected in Josiah's reforms demonstrates understanding of law as a tool for political unification and cultural identity formation. These innovations influenced later Jewish legal development and concepts of constitutional governance, historical assessment, and legacy. Josiah's reign represents the high point of late monarchical period reform efforts, combining religious revival, territorial expansion, and legal innovation. His achievements in religious centralization and legal standardization had lasting influence on Jewish religious and cultural development. The tragic end of his reign illustrates the challenges small kingdoms faced in navigating great power politics. His miscalculation regarding Egyptian-Babylonian rivalry demonstrates the difficulty of maintaining independence in a volatile international environment. Modern political analysis can find insights in Josiah's experience about the relationship between religious and political reform, the challenges of timing political initiatives with international developments, and the risks of overextending political ambitions beyond available resources. Josiah's legacy influenced later Jewish political and religious thought, particularly concepts about righteous kingship, legal reform, and religious purification that continue to influence political and religious movements today. The historical influence of these Old Testament texts extends far beyond their original ancient Near Eastern context, shaping legal systems, political movements, and intellectual traditions that continue to influence human societies today. To understand their enduring historical significance, we must trace their transmission and adaptation through different historical periods and cultural contexts. The translation of Hebrew texts into Greek during the Hellenistic period represents one of the most significant cultural transmission events in ancient history. The Septuagint, produced in Alexandria during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, made Hebrew wisdom literature available to the broader Mediterranean world. This translation facilitated the integration of Hebrew ethical and legal concepts into Greek philosophical traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Qumran demonstrates the care with which these texts were preserved and transmitted. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the mid-20th century, include copies of biblical texts that confirm the remarkable accuracy of textual transmission over centuries. This preservation effort indicates the historical importance these texts held for ancient Jewish communities. The historical influence of Hebrew wisdom literature on Roman legal development is evident in the writings of early Christian authors who were familiar with both traditions. The emphasis on individual rights, ethical governance, and social responsibility that appears in Hebrew texts influenced the development of Roman legal concepts that eventually shaped Western legal traditions. The prophetic tradition's influence on later political movements is historically documented through the writings of early Christian authors, medieval political theorists, and modern political reformers. The concept of holding rulers accountable to higher moral standards, which originated in the Hebrew prophetic tradition, became a fundamental principle of medieval and modern political theory. The historical transmission of these texts through Islamic scholarship represents another significant cultural bridge. Islamic scholars preserved and transmitted Hebrew and Aramaic texts, ensuring their survival through periods when they might otherwise have been lost. This preservation effort contributed to the eventual recovery of these texts in medieval Europe. The influence of Hebrew wisdom literature on medieval European education is documented in the curricula of cathedral schools and early universities. The emphasis on practical ethics and social responsibility that appears in Hebrew texts influenced the development of medieval Christian education and the emergence of scholastic philosophy. The historical impact of these texts on the development of international law is evident in the writings of medieval and early modern legal theorists. The prophetic emphasis on justice, the wisdom literature's concern for fair business practices, and Job's treatment of individual rights all contributed to the development of concepts that eventually became fundamental principles of international law. The role of these texts in the development of printing technology is historically significant. Hebrew texts were among the first non-Latin works to be printed in Europe, driving technological innovations in typography and contributing to the spread of literacy. The Gutenberg Bible and other early printed Hebrew texts represent important milestones in the history of communication technology. The historical influence of these texts on the development of modern democratic theory is documented in the writings of political theorists from the 16th through 18th centuries. The prophetic tradition's emphasis on governmental accountability, the wisdom literature's concern for social justice, and Job's treatment of individual dignity all influence the development of democratic political theory. The archaeological record provides evidence for the historical influence of these texts on material culture. Inscriptions, artwork, and architectural elements from various historical periods demonstrate the ongoing cultural influence of Hebrew wisdom literature, prophetic themes, and Job's philosophical insights. The historical role of these texts in the development of modern social movements is extensively documented. The abolitionist movement, labor reform movements, civil rights movements, and contemporary human rights activism all drew inspiration from Hebrew prophetic literature and wisdom traditions. This influence can be traced through the writings and speeches of movement leaders. The influence of Hebrew wisdom literature on the development of modern economic theory is evident in the writings of economists from Adam Smith to contemporary theorists. The wisdom literature's emphasis on fair business practices, concern for economic justice, and understanding of market dynamics influenced the development of ethical economic theory. The historical preservation of these texts through manuscript traditions across different cultures demonstrates their enduring significance. Hebrew manuscripts, Greek translations, Latin versions, and vernacular translations all contributed to the preservation and transmission of these texts through different historical periods. The role of these texts in the development of modern educational systems is historically documented. The emphasis on character formation, practical wisdom, and social responsibility that appears in Hebrew texts influenced the development of modern educational philosophy and pedagogy. The historical influence of these texts on the development of modern legal systems is evident in constitutional documents, legal codes, and judicial decisions that reference Hebrew legal and ethical principles. The concept of individual rights, governmental accountability, and social justice that appears in these texts influenced the development of modern constitutional law. The ongoing archaeological investigation of sites related to these texts continues to provide new historical insights. Recent discoveries at sites throughout the ancient Near East have confirmed the historical accuracy of many details in these texts, while also providing new information about their cultural and historical context. The historical methodology evident in these texts, their careful analysis of social, political, and economic issues influenced the development of modern historical scholarship. The prophetic tradition's emphasis on connecting contemporary events to broader patterns of cause and effect contributed to the development of modern historical analysis. The preservation and study of these texts through different historical periods demonstrates their ongoing significance for understanding human history and development. These texts provide invaluable insight into ancient Near Eastern civilizations while also documenting the development of ideas and institutions that continue to shape human societies. The historical legacy of these Hebrew texts extends across cultures, languages, and historical periods, demonstrating their enduring significance for understanding human civilization. Their influence on legal systems, political movements, educational institutions, and social reform efforts continues to this day, making them essential sources for understanding the historical development of human societies and the ideas that continue to shape our world. As we reach the end of our historical investigation, we find ourselves not just at the conclusion of an academic study, but at the recognition of one of history's most remarkable phenomena: how ideas born in the hill country of ancient Palestine nearly 3,000 years ago became the intellectual foundation for much of human civilization. Think about what we've uncovered today. In the markets of ancient Samaria, scribes were recording observations about human behavior that would eventually influence the development of modern psychology and organizational theory. In the courts of ancient Jerusalem, prophets were articulating concepts of governmental accountability that wouldn't be formally codified in political systems until the 18th century. In the intellectual circles of post-exilic Judah, anonymous authors were wrestling with questions about suffering and meaning that continue to challenge philosophers today. But perhaps the most historically significant aspect of our investigation is what it reveals about the nature of historical influence itself. These texts didn't survive and spread because they were imposed by military conquest or political power. They survived because generation after generation found in them practical wisdom for organizing societies, ethical frameworks for governance, and intellectual tools for understanding the human condition. The archaeological record tells us that these texts were carefully preserved through the destruction of kingdoms, the exile of populations, and the rise and fall of empires. They were translated in 2 languages, adapted to new cultural contexts, and integrated into legal and educational systems across the ancient world. This process of preservation and transmission represents one of the most successful examples of cultural continuity in human history. What makes this historically remarkable is that these weren't the products of a major imperial power or a dominant military force. Ancient Israel and Judah were small kingdoms caught between much larger empires. Yet their intellectual and cultural contributions outlasted the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, and countless other political entities that once dominated the ancient Near East. The historical methodology we've employed today examining these texts through archaeological evidence, comparative analysis, and cultural context reveals something profound about the relationship between ideas and historical change. The concepts of social justice articulated by the prophets, the practical wisdom codified in Proverbs, and the philosophical sophistication demonstrated in Job didn't just influence later thinkers, they provided intellectual frameworks that enabled the development of more complex and humane forms of social organization. As historians, we must recognize that we're not just studying ancient documents, we're investigating the origins of many of the ideas that continue to shape contemporary debates about governance, ethics, economics, and human rights. The prophetic critique of economic inequality resonates in contemporary discussions about wealth distribution. The wisdom literature's emphasis on character and integrity influences modern approaches to leadership and education. Jobs wrestling with suffering and meaning provides frameworks that continue to influence how societies respond to crisis and trauma. The historical continuity is striking. The same questions that occupied ancient Near Eastern intellectuals: how should societies be organized? What do leaders owe to those they govern? How do we maintain hope and meaning in the face of loss? Continue to be central concerns for every human generation. Perhaps most importantly, our historical investigation reveals that these texts represent not just ancient religious documents, but some of humanity's earliest and most sophisticated attempts to develop systematic approaches to ethics, governance, and meaning-making. They document the emergence of ideas about individual dignity, social responsibility, and moral accountability that became foundational to later political and legal systems. The historical significance of these Hebrew texts lies not in their religious claims, but in their role as intellectual catalysts that helped shape the development of human civilization. They provided conceptual frameworks that enabled later developments in law, politics, philosophy, and social organization. They demonstrated that small communities could produce ideas powerful enough to influence the entire course of human history. The hidden stories we've uncovered today aren't just ancient history, they're the ongoing story of how human beings develop the ideas and institutions that make civilization possible. And that story continues to be written, with each generation building on the intellectual foundations laid by those who came before.